My name is Peter Fleming. I'm the librarian in Pearse Street Library, and we are hosting this event tonight. So without further ado, here's Mary Louise O'Donnell to give tonight's talk.
That's great. Thanks very much, Peter. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining our talk this evening. So I would like to begin with an extract from a poem by Thomas Travers Burke called The Royal Visit. It captures the euphoric mood that was palpable in Dublin in the run-up to and during the visit of George IV from the 12th of August to the 3rd of September 1821. He comes benignly as the heavenly dew, teeming with fond paternal zeal for you. Green land of harps, he comes to cheer a spot that oft hath deemed itself obscure, forgot. Like a sad widow on a drear world cast, exposed to bleak adversity's chill blast, forsaken by her sons in utmost need, with scarce a friend her hapless cause to plead. Fear not, Hibernia, to thee doth remain a royal sire, who flieth to sustain thy drooping heart, and shield thee from all ill, whose bounteous hand thy cup of joy will fill, whose bosom beats responsive to thy cares, whose every word, whose every act declares a soul with pure and genial feeling warmed, a soul for mercy and for glory formed. At 5 p.m. on the 12th of August 1821, George IV disembarked at the West Pier in Howth on his first and only visit to Ireland. The king, who was dressed in a blue frock, blue pantaloons, a black cravat, Hessian boots, white silk gloves, and a foraging cap with gold lace, was so overwhelmed by the positive reception that he spontaneously announced, quote, "This is one of the happiest days of my life. I have long wished to visit you. My heart has always been Irish. This day has shown me that I am beloved by my Irish citizens, and I love Ireland." End quote. George IV was crowned king on the 19th of July 1821. Even before his coronation, he planned to visit Ireland, and nothing would alter these plans, not even the death of his estranged wife Caroline 5 days before arriving in Dublin. The visit would inaugurate his reign, and he was determined to reap the benefits of a meticulously orchestrated series of events set in motion in early 1821. To begin, it might be helpful to give a brief background to the controversial figure that was George IV. Born in 1762, George, Prince of Wales, married Maria Fitzherbert, a twice widowed Catholic, in 1785, breaching the Royal Marriage Act enacted by his father, George III. This bill made it illegal for any member of the royal family to marry without permission. The marriage was not publicly acknowledged, and he later married Caroline of Brunswick, largely because he was in debt and the Parliament promised to increase his allowance if he did. Caroline bore him one child, a daughter christened Charlotte, and George and Caroline separated soon after her birth. During the period in 1811, when George III was debilitated by illness, his son was appointed Prince Regent. This official role came with conditions. Namely, the regency would be terminated when the king was restored to full health, and the Prince Regent's powers would be restricted until February 1812. Unfortunately for George, Prince of Wales, and now Prince Regent, the Act bestowed responsibility on him without executive power. George was a deeply unpopular figure and frequently had missiles or other objects thrown at him as he drove in public. He was a constant figure of ridicule and was viciously lampooned by satirists and caricaturists. Even his accession to the throne on the 29th of January 1820, following the death of his father, did not improve the situation. The coronation ceremony was originally planned for the 1st of August 1820, but the return of his estranged wife Caroline from the continent scuppered these plans. She was determined to be crowned queen consort, but George was determined to deprive her of this honour. He immediately instigated divorce proceedings on account of her adulterous behaviour and requested that the Tory government introduce a bill of pains and penalties to deprive Caroline of the title, rights, privileges, and exemptions of Queen Consort. The whole process was ill-advised and effectively turned into a very public and scandalous trial, during which hundreds of witnesses submitted evidence confirming her adulterous and immoral lifestyle. In the end, there was insufficient evidence to support the bill, and it was abandoned in November 1820. Ironically, it was Caroline who benefited most from the ordeal. She gained considerable support from the British public, who were sympathetic to her and appalled by her estranged husband's attempts to humiliate her. Eventually, a settlement was reached, and she received £50,000, but she did not feature in the coronation ceremony on the 19th of July 1821. In fact, she was refused entry to the coronation, and that evening she supposedly drank a cocktail of laudanum and milk of magnesia, and died several weeks later on the 7th of August. George IV received the news of Caroline's death en route to Ireland for his first official visit as sovereign. The King's private secretary, Lord Bloomfield, was sent to Dublin in advance of the visit to oversee the necessary preparations. His primary role was to liaise with the most influential figures in Irish politics and society, and to ensure that they would participate fully in all public celebrations during the visit. The visit was also preceded by several meetings in July 1821, at which civic leaders and politicians, including the Lord Mayor, Abraham Bradley King, and Daniel O'Connell, gathered to discuss the itinerary and royal protocol. It was decided that potentially seditious iconography would be prohibited, and the royal visit would be a representation of unity amongst Irish people rather than a forum to reiterate demands for Catholic emancipation and political reform. It was agreed that green flags would not be flown during the sovereign's visit, and blue flags with various figures or symbols would be flown in honour of the King. Prominent Catholics such as O'Connell and the Earl of Fingal, Arthur Plunkett, were convinced that by showing loyalty to George IV, their call for emancipation might, at the very least, be viewed more favourably by their sovereign. There was a general hope amongst all sides that the visit would not merely be a ceremonial one, but would result in lasting economic and social improvements for all Irish people. In advance of the visit, several public letters were addressed to the Irish people. These letters outlined the King's itinerary, detailed the most appropriate manner to welcome him, and highlighted his positive kingly attributes. In the King's visit to Ireland, in a letter addressed to the people of Ireland, the writer noted, quote, "A brave and loyal people are always animated, in peace or in war, by the presence of their king. In war, he leads them to victory or a glorious death, and in peace, he establishes their liberty and happiness, and secures their prosperity by the enactment of wise laws. Our king comes with the olive branch, the harbinger of peace. In the spirit of peace, let us receive him. In the lapse of centuries, no king traversed our soil but for purposes of war and desolation. Irishmen, His Majesty pays you a spontaneous visit, an intention not lightly taken up, but the result of mature deliberation." End quote. George IV was presented as a benevolent father figure who loved his subjects and would improve their conditions. He was a true king and therefore should be given a hearty, kingly welcome. This strong emphasis on kingship is very interesting and is a recurring theme in the poetry and songs written to celebrate the royal visit in 1821. George IV assumed the role of King of Ireland, or Erin's king. In fact, in some songs and poetry written to celebrate the visit, Brian Boru, the last High King of Ireland, is frequently associated with George IV. The association of George IV with former kings of Ireland was part of a narrative which established the sovereign as the rightful ruler of all Irish people and heir to the kingship of Ireland. This idea is epitomised in the song Erin's King in the lines, "To Erin's kings of other days, her minstrels swept the string, and bards shall now its music raise to welcome Erin's king." This song, written by Luke Ternan and set to the air of Thomas Moore's The Harp That Once Through Tara's Halls, was sung at concerts during the royal visit by the renowned soprano Miss Stevens. This notion of George IV as Erin's king was, of course, a myth. but it may have originated from a series of events in the 1780s and 90s, which suggested that the young prince was sympathetic to the plight of the Irish people and may have even been a supporter of limited emancipation for Catholics. In an anonymous memorandum housed at the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle, dating from 1785, the author proposed that George, Prince of Wales, should be crowned King of Ireland. If this came to pass, then the prince's plan was to, quote, repeople the country with nobility, gentry, and yeomanry, which would in turn inspire new life in the peasantry and bring about prosperity and stability in Ireland, end quote. During the first Regency crisis in 1788-89, the Irish Parliament offered George the Regency of Ireland, but his father rallied and this idea was quickly dismissed. In the mid-1790s, George expressed his desire to become Irish Viceroy, but this idea was not progressed. These attempts to engage with Irish politics and the Irish people, and intimations of support for Catholic emancipation, were well received and suggested that he, unlike his father and grandfather, might eventually be a king who would bring about positive economic and social improvements in Ireland. It is noteworthy, however, that when there was an opportunity to finally address many of these issues during the Regency crisis from 1811 onwards, George declined and vowed instead to deal with these controversial issues during his reign. Nevertheless, Irish hopes were high, and the visit in 1821 was eagerly anticipated. Everyone played their part in heightening the mood in advance of the visit. In particular, newspapers and journals, whose columns were filled with articles praising George IV. The media played a central role in ensuring the success of the visit, but everyone had a role to play. In fact, George IV's visit to Ireland has often been likened to a carefully managed theatrical performance accompanied by an elaborate display of regal pageantry, in which the king assumed the principal role and the Irish people, Irish symbols, and even the Irish harp and harper were used to create an historic triumph. If the king played the principal role, then the role of the rest of the cast, which included the aristocracy, Irish politicians, and the general public, was simple: to show unity, loyalty, not to highlight any grievances, and in return, they would gain benefits of some kind. After his arrival in Howth on the 12th of August, the king spent a few days in private as a mark of respect for his dead spouse. He made his formal entry and procession through the streets of Dublin on the 17th of August. From that day until his departure, military and regal pageantry, elaborately decorated buildings, and a multitude of ecstatic loyal subjects and curious onlookers greeted the king in Dublin, Kildare, and Meath. There was an air of excitement in the capital, and expectations were high on all sides. As early as 6 o'clock on the morning of George IV's formal entry into Dublin, the streets were busy, as carriages, horsemen, and pedestrians moved to the places allotted to them. By 8 o'clock, some of the representative bodies had assembled. At 9 o'clock, the carriages of the nobility, the officers of state, and the gentry who were to take part in the procession arrived. The gentlemen were in full dress, and the servants wore new and splendid liveries. Even the horses were decked out with blue ribbons, blue being the welcome colour agreed to be worn in honour of the king. Platforms had been erected in various places along the route of the procession, where seats were sold to the highest bidder. These seats were occupied by elegantly dressed ladies. The streets at each side were thronged with people. Two lines of soldiers kept a passage clear in the middle for the procession. The windows and balconies were filled with ladies and gentlemen in full dress, and even the roofs of all the houses were packed with people. The pageantry commenced at the northern end of Sackville Street, where the king formally entered the city through a specially constructed arch with a banner reading Céad Míle Fáilte, 100,000 welcomes. Around 12 o'clock, the king entered in an open carriage drawn by 8 horses led by grooms and attended by a train of footmen in the finest liveries. The king was dressed in full military uniform, decorated with the order and ribbon of St. Patrick. His hat was ornamented with an enormous rosette of shamrocks. The moment the king arrived through and entered the city gates, there was a loud burst of enthusiasm, which rippled all along Sackville Street to Carlisle Bridge and reverberated along the whole line to Dublin Castle. The iconography associated with the visit ranged from the ubiquitous Union flags flown over various Dublin landmarks, including Trinity College, the Bank of Ireland and the Mansion House, to less prominent images of crowned harps and figures of Hibernia with her harp. Every moment of the visit, from the king's entry into Dublin to his departure from Dunleary on the 3rd of September, was covered in minute detail in contemporary newspapers and journals. Details concerning his sartorial choices, commentary on his public utterances, and listings of the guests that attended banquets, levees, and other events filled the pages of the Freeman's Journal, the Dublin Evening Post, and the Belfast Newsletter. These sources provided very detailed accounts of the daily itinerary of the royal visit. Unfortunately, I can only give an overview of some of those public engagements that George IV attended during his visit. But I recommend that anyone who wishes to find out more about the King's visit and his heavy schedule during his visit should consult these newspapers and also an excellent article by Karina Holton in an issue of Irish Historical Studies, and the article is called All Our Joys Will Be Completed. The day after George IV's triumphal and spectacular entry into Dublin, he attended a grand military review in the Phoenix Park. The king appeared in full military uniform on horseback. On Sunday, the king, in full Windsor uniform, attended a service at Christchurch Cathedral, accompanied by the Lord Lieutenant, the Duke of Montrose, Lord Sidmouth, and the Marquis of Londonderry. On Monday, the 20th, a levee was held at Dublin Castle, at which more than 2,000 gentlemen paid homage to the sovereign. After the levee, he received approximately 270 addresses from various groups, including the Roman Catholic bishops, members of the Presbyterian Church, and the Society of Friends. On Tuesday, the 21st, the king had a drawing room at Dublin Castle, and the following day he attended a performance of a play by the Irish playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan at the Albany New Theatre on Hawkins Street, and this theatre was later renamed the Theatre Royal in honour of George IV. Thursday, the 23rd, was filled with engagements from morning until late evening. His visit to the Linen Hall was followed by a short stop at the Bank of Ireland, formerly the House of Parliament. That evening, members of Dublin Corporation organised a banquet in honour of the King at the newly constructed round room of the Mansion House on Dawson Street. The King was surrounded at the royal table by dignitaries of church and state. The elaborate evening concluded with the performance by 4 Irish harpers who were former students of the Irish Harp Society of Dublin. These were Edward McBride, Valentine Rennie, James McMonagle, and John McLaughlin. The harpers performed compositions by Thomas and William Kennellan, Turlough O'Carolan and O'Daly, and the titles of the pieces were presented in Gaelic script and in English translation or anglicised form in the concert programme. The concert, which opened with God Save the King, included 34 pieces, almost half of which were compositions by Carolan, or Terence Carolan, as he was named in the programme. Compositions by Carolan, including his concerto, O'Rourke's Noble Fare, Planxty Johnson and Dr. Hart, were performed along with popular Irish airs such as Patrick's Day, Ireland Forever, Mary McAlpine, and Eleanor Rowan, better known as Eileen Roon. On the day after the concert, George IV visited the Dublin Society House, where a large number of tents were erected in the lawns. 3 harpers robed in the antique garb of minstrels entertained the royal entourage near the King's marquee. Harpers performing for the King on this occasion and at the Round Room the night before was significant. It was a reminder of the important role harpers played in Gaelic society, performing music to celebrate and inspire their chieftains or kings. But now, for the first time in Ireland, the music of the Irish harp was used to celebrate a British sovereign rather than an Irish king. Contemporary poetry and songs written to celebrate George IV's visit exploited this powerful image of a harper praising his king. In To Our Island Harp, the writer used the motif of the sleeping harp to represent the Irish people. He encouraged Irish people to rise from their sleep and forget their despair so they could celebrate the arrival of their king. And just a quote from that poem: "Awake, harp of Erin, the breezes are blowing, the clouds that so long o'er thy green isle have hung, and the mildews of night from thy sweet chords are going, once bold in their anthems and wild in their song. Too long have the notes of thy sweetness been sleeping, too long hath the night of thy sorrow remained. And even the soft eye of the stranger was weeping when he saw thee all tuneless, with sorrow enchained." In another song, "Wake thy numbers, harp of Erin," the writer implored the Irish people, the Irish harp, a metaphor for the Irish people, to learn tunes which were not sorrowful. The harp, which was unable to perform lively music because it had languished in silence for so long, is now awakened and transformed by the arrival of the King, who will promote harmony among the Irish people. A quote from that song: "Raise the song and full rebounding, let thy notes, my harp, arise. Catch our spirit and resounding, give its accent to the skies. Let our prince partake our pleasure, let him know its ample measure. Thus, when state affairs permit him, we again may hope to greet him, that grateful Erin, honoured as of old, may oft with pride her patriot king behold." Songs, poetry, and newspaper articles abounded with references to the spirit of unity and concord that resulted from George IV's visit. The excitement did not dissipate in the final days of the visit. On Monday, the 27th of August, the King returned to Dublin after spending the weekend with his mistress, the Marchioness of Cunningham, at Slane Castle. That evening, he dined with fellows of the University of Dublin at Trinity College. The installation of the Knights of the Order of St. Patrick took place in St. Patrick's Cathedral on the 28th of August and was followed by the installation ball at the Round Room of the Rotunda, where over 2,000 guests were in attendance. A trip to the races, a service at the Chapel Royal in Dublin Castle, and a visit to Pariscourt were other notable events during the visit. On Monday, the 3rd of September, the King departed from Dún Laoghaire with the words, quote, "Whenever an opportunity offers wherein I can serve Ireland, I shall seize on it with eagerness." End quote. The royal visit had come to an end, and Irish people eagerly anticipated the generous bounty that would result from it. Unfortunately, they were to be sorely disappointed. The visit was an overwhelming success for George IV. He savoured the lavish spectacle and the sumptuous food and drink. His public image was rehabilitated temporarily in Britain, and his confidence was boosted by the apparent loyalty of his Irish subjects. His interest in Ireland was superficial and fleeting, and he made no effort to apprise himself of the actual state of his Irish subjects. In the Irish Avatar, Lord Byron was scathing in his criticism of the king. He wrote, "Ere the daughter of Brunswick is cold in her grave, and her ashes still float to their home o'er the tide, lo, George the triumphant speeds over the wave to the long-cherished isle, which he loved like his bride." True, the great of her bright and brief era are gone, the rainbow-like epoch where freedom could pause for the few little years out of centuries won, which betrayed not, or crushed not, or wept not her cause. True, the chains of the Catholic clank o'er his rags, the castle still stands, and the senate's no more, and the famine which dwelt on her freedomless crags is extending its steps to her desolate shore. To her desolate shore, where the emigrant stands for a moment to gaze ere he flies from his hearth. Tears fall on his change, though it drops from his hands, for the dungeon he quits is the place of his birth. But he comes, the Messiah of royalty comes, like a goodly Leviathan rolled from the waves. Then receive him as best such an advent becomes, with a legion of cooks and an army of slaves. He comes in the promise and bloom of threescore, to perform in the pageant the sovereign's part. But long live the shamrock, which shadows him o'er. Could the green in his hat be transferred to his heart? The majority of the king's Irish subjects earned nothing for their enthusiastic and excessive displays, and it took a further 8 years for George IV to allow the emancipation of his Catholic subjects. Those who had played a prominent political role in creating a temporary spirit of loyalty and harmony were left embarrassed by the king's lack of sincerity and the perception of the visit as an expensive farce. Daniel O'Connell's extreme gestures of loyalty to the sovereign attracted the wrath of many contemporary writers, including Thomas Moore and Byron. They were appalled by O'Connell's servile behaviour toward a monarch who was derided and despised in Britain. However, it was O'Connell who learned most from George IV's visit in 1821. The pageantry, triumphal processions, flags and symbols that accompanied the visit provided a crucial model for the mass gatherings agitating for the emancipation of Catholics in the 1820s and later repeal of the Act of Union in the 1830s and 40s. What was the legacy of the royal visit? Aside from the poetry, songs, and paintings, the material legacy includes the round room of the mansion house, which was added at a cost of £8,000, a new bridge over the River Liffey called King's Bridge, a memorial at Dunleary in the form of an obelisk surmounted by a crown resting on 4 stones resembling cannonballs, and an imprint of the spot where George IV's sacred feet drunkenly stumbled onto Irish shore at Howth. Aside from that, unfortunately, the visit had little impact on the lives of most Irish people. One could argue that the visit was never really going to bring about any meaningful changes in economic or political terms. It was never going to make a difference in the lives of ordinary Irish people. Yet millions of Irish people believed it would, and they were convinced enough to put their grievances and differences aside for a few months in 1821. For those few months, there was a genuine air of hope and optimism. Unfortunately, this positive atmosphere was short-lived, as within weeks of the king's departure, Agrarian unrest flared up again, rents and evictions increased, and the effects of recession, reduction in wages, unemployment, and poverty caused increased misery for millions of Irish people. It seems the only people who benefited from the visit were the merchants who enjoyed increased sales of fine food and beverages, the tailors who were inundated with requests for new dresses, suits, and uniforms, the landlords who increased their rents significantly during the royal visit, and one John Egan, a harp maker with the premises on Dawson Street, Dublin. It seems that Egan was determined to attract the attention of the king. So, in an excessive display of loyalty, he extravagantly decorated every inch of the exterior of his premises at 30 Dawson Street. It was not unusual to decorate shops or businesses with lanterns, colourful illuminations, and flags during the visit. In fact, it created a wonderful atmosphere and heightened the mood of celebration. But Egan took decorating to a new level, and there are several detailed accounts of the results. Here is one such account from the royal visit containing a full and circumstantial account of everything connected with the king's visit to Ireland. Quote, "No private house was decorated with more brilliancy, taste, and effect than this. In the centre, a most splendid transparency representing our beloved sovereign seated on his throne, arrayed in his royal robes and regalia. Hibernia modestly presenting a portable Irish harp, beautifully illuminated, attended by a bard dressed in the ancient costume. In the right compartment was Britannia with a cornucopia, shield lion with shamrocks, roses, and thistles amicably entwined. In the left, the crown shedding its benign rays over the emblems of the arts, sciences, and commerce. Beneath the crown, the representation of an exquisitely executed harp. The left side of the house was as brilliant as the centre front. A circular transparency supporting a shield with the harp and crown with one hand, while the other grasped a shillelagh, surrounded also with a shamrock, thistle, and rose at the top. The gateway to the harp manufactory had an elliptic arch with a crown and alternate festoons of lamps and shamrocks to complete the whole. Over the transparency in the centre of the house, a harp the size of the ancient harp which belonged to Brian Boru, now in the College Museum. And either side, George IV Rex, and overall a splendid imperial crown. Within weeks of Egan's excessive display, George IV appointed him as his harp maker. Egan used George IV's patronage as an entree into affluent and influential social circles to create some of the most beautiful modern Irish harps. He made thousands of harps, and they can be found in museums and collections all around the world. The reason I mention Egan is because it was my research on his life and career that led me to George IV many years ago, and I'm glad of it. Egan's story is also fascinating, but one that will have to be saved for a talk at a Dublin Festival of History in the future. Thanks for listening.
So Tommy has two questions. First is, why was George IV so disliked? And was he small in stature?
Okay, yeah, well, to answer the second question first, yes, he was quite a petite gentleman, but he had a very extrovert, outgoing character. I suppose the reason he was so disliked, it was a kind of the accumulation of many years of his kind of what you could describe as his excessive lifestyle. He loved fine food, he loved fine wine, he had a string of extramarital affairs. The particular type of woman and mistress that he was attached to, she generally tended to be older and voluptuous. He enjoyed kind of the high life, the good life, and by all accounts, he didn't really have any job. So he was somebody who in early life had expressed an interest in joining the military, but his father wouldn't allow him to join up, to enlist. So he spent most of his life kind of with no purpose, really. So all this kind of extravagant, excessive lifestyle was something that he enjoyed and he savoured increasingly as the years went on. And even when, as you mentioned, when he acceded to the throne, and he would have been, close to his late 50s at that stage. So he had spent his whole life without any meaningful purpose. So even when he came to the position at that stage, it should have been an opportunity for him to prove himself. But the whole sorry affair, the divorce proceedings against his wife, his estranged wife, Carolyn, further kind of alienated him from the British public. I think at the time it was such a scandalous kind of thing to do, that he turned public opinion against him. And I'm not sure what his motivation. Well, his motivation for doing it was pure and simple, that he did not want her to be queen consort. So he came across in public as being a very petty, a very belittling, a very arrogant, a very insecure man. And that the public picked up on that. And instead of siding with him and kind of, showing loyalty to the sovereign, they took Caroline's side. And yeah, he had a very, very unpleasant time travelling through the streets of London on his way to Parliament. Missiles, rotten fruit, and worse was thrown at him. He was hissed, he was booed. The whole coronation ceremony probably didn't do him any favours either. He was determined that Caroline wasn't going to come into the coronation ceremony or have any role to play in it. So he had the doors of Westminster Abbey locked. So there are reports in contemporary newspapers that she arrived at the doors and was heard knocking and shouting to be allowed entry. And of course, this was further humiliation. And people gathered on the streets of London that day to see the coronation, saw all of this and saw the further humiliation and thought, this is a very unpleasant man, this is a very weak king, and we really have no respect for him. The fact afterwards that she went home and supposedly committed suicide that evening, even though there was a lot of kind of talk in the press at the time that perhaps he had attempted to have her killed, and that didn't go down well in amongst the general public either. But all of those things kind of combined just to make him come across as a very petty, unpleasant man.
Naomi Calagaro has asked, could you comment please on the influence, if any, of Maria Edgeworth?
On what, the royal visit?
I presume on the royal visit or on George. I'll come back to that question to see if she kind of clarifies. I'll move on to the next one. So next was, from a security point of view, was there a lot of concern about George IV's safety, or were there any attempts on the royal party during the visit?
No, there were no attempts on George IV's life or any of the royal party during the visit. I think Lord Bloomfield had come in advance of the visit, and he had very much established to try to kind of generate a very positive kind of narrative for the whole visit. So combined with the media, who kind of they would have published daily positive articles on George IV and kind of whipped up a sense of excitement and euphoria amongst the public. I think there was a genuinely positive atmosphere amongst the Irish public, and those that lined the streets, and they lined the streets in their hundreds and thousands, they seemed to really enjoy the carnival atmosphere. They hadn't experienced anything like this royal pageantry before, and they savoured every minute of it. So I think instead of a kind of a pessimistic, or maybe looking at George IV's visit as threatening, I think people actually saw it as public celebrations, an opportunity really to showcase Dublin, to showcase the loyalty of Irish people, and to showcase how they could put on a party and a spectacle to beat the band.
There's another question with the last question. If possibly, if you just move closer to your mic, that might else. Is there anything I can think of? The last question was there no fuss that he was with his mistress, even though they acknowledged that he had been legally widowed at the time?
No, I think it was commonly known that throughout his marriage that he had a string of mistresses. So the Marchioness of Cunningham was, I think, probably amongst his most favourite. And she was his mistress pretty much to the end of his life in 1830. So there was no controversy over that. Um, People seem to turn a blind eye to his extramarital affairs. And I suppose when he arrived in Dublin, he went through the motions of appearing to go into a temporary period of mourning for Caroline, his estranged wife. So, really, from the 17th of August onwards, from his formal entry into Dublin, he played his part. He went to the various public engagements. He was there. He was well dressed. He said what he needed to do. So, after a week, he went and spent the weekend in Slane Castle with the Marchioness of Cunningham, and that was his private time with her. And I think that he enjoyed those few days. It was something that he had anticipated, and there was even talk at one stage that the road from Dublin, Finglas to Slane had to be straightened so that he could get to his mistress in quick time. So he was obviously very keen to get to her, but certainly there was no controversy and no mention. Even I suppose, even despite the prominence of their relationship, it doesn't seem to have been reported in any negative way in the contemporary press.
Sorry, there's one last question, and then we'll probably have to wrap it up. So, how did Irish attitudes to George evolve during the remaining years of his reign, and did they change during William's subsequent reign and that of the young Victoria? And how did Daniel O'Connell's views change?
Yeah, I suppose there was a huge expectation during the visit that something would come of it. It was never clear exactly. He never made any promises or never claimed that he was going to deliver anything. But the expectation was that he was going to look at least more favourably on emancipation of his Catholic subjects. The other thing was that people assumed that there might be some sort of political reform or that he would use his influence to bring about that. Now, unfortunately, very quickly after the visit, it became clear that he had no further interest in Ireland. So public opinion changed very, very quickly. Political figures such as Daniel O'Connell were reported to have said that they despised him anyway and that he was a pathetic little man. So I think a lot of it was a show, not only by Irish politicians, but also by George IV. So when he came, yes, he alleviated, relieved, took the attention away from some of the despair and the misery that the Irish people were suffering. But it was only temporary for a few weeks. And he moved on with his life, and the Irish people went back to theirs. In terms after his death, well, before his death, he reluctantly agreed to the passing of Catholic emancipation in 1829. He died in 1830, and really, I think you can see that the visit in 1821 was a turning point in Anglo-Irish relations, because I think that was the point when Irish people were prepared to see the positive side of being governed from London. They thought that if there were things, maybe emancipation or reforms that could be given, that they were prepared to kind of toe the line and, do what was asked of them. I think after that, when they saw what a farce the whole 1821 visit had been, I think they really had very little respect for royalty after that. William IV never came to Ireland, and Victoria, of course, came, I think, 4 times during her lengthy reign. So she had, again, that's a discussion probably for another occasion, but her reception when she came to Ireland was also mixed. When she came in the 1840s, she was christened the Famine Queen. a very unfortunate visit to come and a very unfortunate time to choose to visit Ireland. But there wasn't ever the same reception for monarchs after that. It was very much subdued. It wasn't anything like the pageantry or the celebration that had greeted George IV in 1821. So from that perspective, that was a moment in time which was never repeated, and royal figures were never welcomed in that way ever again. Now, as regards the question about Daniel O'Connell, Daniel O'Connell's attitude, I mentioned, changed fairly quickly to George IV. I think George IV's visit taught O'Connell quite a lot, because he saw the pageantry and he saw the parades and he saw the symbolism and he saw how you could mobilize the people to great effect to create this sort of euphoric atmosphere. And he replicated that during his assemblies, during his meetings advocating for Catholic emancipation in the 1820s, and also during the monster meetings in the 1830s and 40s. They were all about theatre, about pageantry, about creating drama around the whole experience. So that's what O'Connell very much picked up from the 1821 visit. And during the monster meetings, particularly at Tara in 1843, they were spectacular events. He arrived to them in a chariot, of all things, based on an old Roman chariot, with the harper in the front playing the harp that once through Tara's halls. And all of this was symbolism that fed in to the message of repeal.
So we've just had a follow-up on the Edgeworth question. Castle Rackrent is said to have influenced George III's perspective on Irish subjects. So did her work or that of her father, Richard Lovell Edgeworth, influence George IV at all? Do you know?
I'm not sure about that. I know that George IV surrounded himself with a particular group of writers, Thomas More, Byron, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, that kind of group. Not sure if Maria Edgeworth was one of them, whether he read her or not. I'm sure he was influenced. He prized himself on being a very cultured man, very much interested in literature, music, the arts, architecture. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if he was familiar with her work. He certainly was very familiar with the political and social situation in Ireland. There's no question about that. Really from the 1780s and 90s onwards, he seemed to be very familiar with the volunteer movement, with the circumstances surrounding the United Irishmen and their rebellion in 1798. So he certainly held opinions on all of that, and may have been drawn to Irish literature or Irish writings or Irish history to kind of familiarise himself with the situation of his Irish subjects.
Okay, and we have one very last one. Not obvious. Did George IV officially open Kingsbridge himself, or was it opened after his visit?
No, it was opened after his visit, and of course that's no longer Kingsbridge anymore. It's Sean Houston Bridge now. So that was it lasted in name only for a very short period.
All right. Thank you very much, Mary.